Good morning. Wow, it's like AA. It's incredible. So we all know this guy. In the West, when we think about who is a moral exemplar, we think of Gandhi. He's the first one on the top of everyone's mind. In fact, that means that in the West here, he has achieved the pinnacle, the greatest honor for being a moral exemplar, which clearly, I don't mean the Nobel Peace Prize. I mean that he was in an Apple ad. But today I wanted to talk with you about somebody who is less well known, but I think for these purposes, when we talk about reinvention, is perhaps an even more salient example. This is B.R. Ambedkar. And in India, he is very well known. In the United States, much less so. But he is the drafter of India's constitution. That's one interesting historical fact. But what's even more interesting about this man, who became one of the chief leaders of India at its independence, was that he was a Dalit, the group of people formerly known as untouchable. Now, Gandhi was a Brahmin, and a lot of the leaders, most of the leaders were, but B.R. Ambedkar came from the lowest caste. He faced discrimination that was just unimaginable to most of us. The name untouchable comes literally from the fact that people did not want to touch an entire class of people. And so in writing India's constitution, he created a very egalitarian document. It actually made the caste system officially illegal. It eradicated it. But of course we know that eradicating something on paper is very different than eradicating it in real life. And so what he's actually perhaps best known for is that he led a mass conversion of 500,000 Dalits to Buddhism in the city of Nagpur, India. I actually didn't even know for a long time that there were Buddhists in India. I mean, obviously it started in India, but it moved east, Japan and lots of other places. But there's a Buddhist community in India largely because of B.R. Ambedkar's efforts. And the reason for it is that he believed that within the construct of Hinduism, he and his people would forever be trapped at the lowest rung of the ladder. And he said, I am not going to stay in this situation. You might call me a Dalit. You might think of me as the lowest caste. But I think of myself as an equal. It was the ultimate rebranding. And irrespective of your religion, irrespective of whether you decide to work in a system or outside a system, both of which are equally valid choices, what I think is important about his story is the fact that he was willing to define himself. There's so many people in the world that want to define you. And really it's about taking back that control and saying, no, here's how I view myself and how I would like you to view me. Because ultimately, when you let other people control your story, it's like a game of telephone. The message always gets muddled. The important parts get left out. People pick up on things that are minor, that are random, that are surface accoutrements. They miss sometimes what's most important. I actually learned that early in my career. I was the New Hampshire Communications Director for Howard Dean, who many of you remember for his iconic scream. And really, when you're in politics, you have everybody trying to define you. That's the name of the game. And I learned then that if you are not willing to put your stake in the ground and be incredibly clear about who you are and what your message is, it's not going to work. Other people will define you always in ways that are less palatable, less desirable than you would want. There's some research that's been done by the Center for Talent Innovation, which is a think tank in New York City. And just as one example of this and how it plays out, they did research into gay employees. And what was their experience like in the workforce? And as you'll see here, I mean, everyone, right? Everyone to a certain extent faces some degree of isolation in their career, at work. Some people, may at different times feel like they are stalled in their career. But some people feel that a lot more than others. And what they discovered, and this is a good message, I guess, about society and where things are going. But what they discovered is that if you compared out GLBT employees to those in the closet, the people who were in the closet felt isolated at nearly twice the rate as the out employees did. They felt their careers were stalled at more than twice the rate of the out employees. What does this mean? Well, really, the reason that people are in the closet is because they feel like that's the thing they have to do. They have to pretend to be somebody else. And in many ways, I mean, certainly I'm not minimizing it. In half the states still in America, people can be fired because they're gay. But more and more, there are many places where it actually is a question of being willing to step up and to stand out, because it turns out that when you are open, when people actually get to know the authentic you, that is what they relate to better. Sometimes we're holding ourselves back because of worries about what the rest of the world is going to think or going to do. And it's certainly not just gay people. My friend Christy Smith of Deloitte, the consulting firm, and Kenji Yoshino of New York University's law school did research into a phenomenon known as covering in the workplace. Covering is a little different than being closeted. If you're covering, if you're closeted, you're pretending, let's say we're talking about sexuality. If you're closeted, you're pretending you're not gay. If you're covering, people might know that. You might technically be out, but you're minimizing it. Maybe everybody else has a picture of their partner on their desk, but you don't. Or if you're African American, maybe you're covering because clearly people know you're African American, but maybe you try not to hang out with so many other African American people so that it doesn't remind people about that. It's about sanding down your differences. And it turns out that actually most of us do that in some ways. If you look here, 83% of LGBT people do that, lesbian, gay, and bisexual. 79% of blacks report covering in the workplace, 2/3 of women. But it's not just the usual suspects. What their research discovered is that 45%, this is nearly half, 45% of straight white males also covered in the workplace. We cover for a million reasons. We cover because we're a military veteran and we worry how that might go over. We cover because maybe we have a health issue we don't want people to know about. Maybe there's a divorce going on that you feel stigmatized about. Maybe someone in your family has a mental health issue that you worry that you can't talk about. Overall, 60% of people, more than 60% of people cover in some way. And what we've learned from their research, from the Center for Talent Innovation Research, is that that is deleterious. If you want to be productive, if you want to be efficient, if you want to be innovative, we need to start bringing our full selves to work and to stop covering in the various ways that we do. This is a woman named Libby Wagner. I wrote a book last year called Reinventing You, and she was one of the people that I profiled. Libby Wagner was an interesting story for me to talk about because you hear all the time, it's sort of an American trope about the management consultant who gets burned out and decides to reinvent herself as a poet. It's a common story in our culture. But what I liked about Libby Wagner's story is that hers was actually the opposite. She was a poet who decided to reinvent herself as a management consultant. Now, as you can imagine, there's only one problem with that, which is that she was absolutely convinced that no one would take her seriously, and that executives would say, what can we possibly learn from a poet? You have an MFA, not an MBA. Get out of here. And so for a long time, when she first started her business, she actually hid the fact that she was a poet. She kept it on the down low. She didn't even talk about it. But what that meant, what she discovered, was that in not talking about it, she didn't have a lot else to talk about. She was a commodity. Why should we hire you? Oh, I don't know. When you're competing with other people on their terms, you're almost always going to lose. There's always going to be somebody who has more experience than you do in a given field, at a given company, in a given vertical. What Libby Wagner had was the fact that she was a poet, and she thought it was a weakness. That's why she covered. But over time, as she got more comfortable, got more confident, she realized that actually her weakness could also be her strength. And for many of us, I think that that's true, that our weakness and our strength is the exact flip side of the coin. She realized that if you are a CEO and you want to be communicating with your stakeholders, your customers, your employees, if you want to be communicating with them, maybe it might make sense to hire someone who has spent a lifetime drilling into the meaning and the nuances of words. Maybe that's a reason to hire her, not a reason to kick her out of the boardroom. And so she began to come out about being a poet. She created an email newsletter called The Boardroom Poet. She made it a big part of her offerings that she was integrating literature and language into her work. Today, she's a successful management consultant. She lives in Seattle. She's worked for almost every company in the Pacific Northwest, Boeing, Nike, all the big Fortune 500 companies. Not in spite of her background, but because of her background, that she was willing to take what seemed like a weakness to the outside world, which she feared would be perceived as a weakness, and instead turned it around, embraced who she was, and used that as a strength. Now for me, and this is me, I don't have one with Larry Bird, but these issues are important. I started to get interested in them early on. Growing up as a little kid, clearly I loved Superman, I loved baseball, I know there's some Hasbro people here, I was obsessed with G.I. Joe, I had the aircraft carrier. Yeah. You know how many G.I. Joes I had? I had 77 G.I. Joes. I think I might have been your best customer. But when you grow up as a little kid in North Carolina, in a very small town in the early 1980s, and you are interested in these things, and you are a girl, you get a little blowback sometimes. That was me too. And so when you're a little kid and you're growing up gay, and you walk into the ladies' room and you have grown women running at you and saying, "What are you doing in here? Get out!" It's a little freaky when you're a little kid. You have to learn to take other people's judgments and realize that they don't have to be your judgments. You can't let other people define you. That helped later on. When I grew up, I became a journalist. This was actually my first real job after graduate school. I was a political reporter. This is my very first cover story that I wrote for the Boston Phoenix. As you can imagine from the fact that the Boston Phoenix no longer exists, didn't necessarily work out well for me. And so about a year into my tenure at the Phoenix as a political reporter, it was a Monday afternoon. They called, the HR guy, Barry, he called me in. He said, "Oh, Dorie, can you stop by my office before the end of the day?" And I was a little naive, and so I didn't think anything of it. I thought, "Oh, I'm getting a new dental plan." That was not it. So I went to Barry's office, and it turned out I'd been laid off. So Monday afternoon, have to go pack up my desk. It's over. my burgeoning career as a journalist was over, and it got a little more complicated the next morning. Erwin was talking about this yesterday. Turns out the next morning was September 11th, 2001. I had been laid off on September 10th. And so when I woke up, the world had changed. The economy had absolutely halted. Planes were not flying. The stock market was shuttered. And I thought, how am I ever going to get another job again? How am I going to find a career? And so we've spent a lot of time, one of the things we talk about here at BIF is turning adversity into opportunity, finding ways to innovate. And so for me, I feel fortunate in my own reinvention that during the course of the next decade, I went on and was able to be a presidential campaign spokesperson and run a nonprofit and make a documentary film and teach for business schools and write books and all kinds of things that probably wouldn't have been possible if I had stayed on the tried and true path of being a journalist. But what it takes is being willing to buck other people's thoughts and judgment. When we lose a job, it's easy to get down, get depressed, to think that it's a referendum on you. But we're now moving from an era where what mattered most was conformity, where what mattered most was being the same as other people, dressing the same, thinking the same, to a new and I think better world where what matters is your ability, as Gandhi and Apple might say, to think different and to bring your whole self to work, to tap into who you are, and above all, to define ourselves so that we can imagine our future. Thank you.